Hello, everyone. Welcome to Adventures Through the Mind. I am your host, as always, James W. Gesso. This voice situation is not an attempt to be more sultry. I am sadly hit with the laryngitis today, so I'm going to keep this intro very short because I am in quite a bit of pain when I'm talking. Today's interview is with the Dank Duchess. Oakland, California-based, the Dank Duchess is an internationally recognized cannabis cultivator, hash maker, and writer who believes intentional and mindful cannabis use will change our society. She has made it her mission to impart her knowledge of cannabis and hash to anyone who will receive it. Duchess combines her love for good cannabis, fun living, and mind-blowing experiences to create the life she wants to live. From growing plants to making culinary creations and meditating to working out, she infuses cannabis into every aspect of her life. While versed in cannabis bubble hash making, cannabis media, and cannabis culture, she journeys to cannabis-friendly locales worldwide to expand her knowledge, host educational parties, and spread cannabis awareness. I met Duchess when she was presenting at the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference in 2019, and she gave a great talk, and afterwards she turned out to be a really awesome person. So multiple layers of why I wanted to have her on the show. We talk explicitly quite a bit about hashish in the beginning, and then we shift into cannabis and cannabis culture, as well as harm reduction culture in Black communities across the United States. Before we get into the episode, big thank you to my patrons on Patreon, especially the people whose names are listed on the screen here on YouTube, as they give significant amounts. But thank you to all my patrons who make this podcast possible for everybody. If you're not a patron and you'd like to become one, please do. I'd appreciate that. Patreon, as well as multiple other support options are available at jameswgesso.com/support, or you can check out the links in the description to this episode wherever you're listening to it. So thank you very much for dealing with my raspy, very quiet, almost ASMR voice, and please do enjoy this interview with the Dank Duchess here on Adventures Through the Mind, episode 117.
Duchess, the Dank Duchess, welcome to Adventures Through the Mind.
Thank you for having me here.
So I wanted to talk specifically in the beginning and get sort of like a really nerdy look at cannabis and hashish in specific as a expertise hash maker yourself. And so to start us off, although I suspect much of my listeners will already be mildly familiar with some of the the biochemical constituents of cannabis, maybe you can give us the rundown of the cannabis plant herself and the psychoactive components in which she is famous for.
Okay, so don't want to get boring with the anatomy, but let's just say this. We have the cannabis plant, which we have seen. Often what you see is maybe a cannabis leaf. So that has 5 fingers, 7 fingers, 9 fingers. But when we're smoking, we're not smoking that leaf, but rather we're smoking buds. So if you separate leaves and get down to it, the buds are the flower of the cannabis plant. So just as many plants have flowers, this is what carries all the seeds, which aids it, not aids, which is what we have reproduction from. However, when we were making cannabis for what we wanted for medicine or for recreational use, for smoking it, for anything like that, besides any fiber production or seed production, we want sin semilla, which means without seeds in Spanish. And the way we get this sin semilla is that when you exclude males from the garden, you have females only growing, then she still creates buds, which are covered in trichomes, but no seeds. And that's what we really want. I mentioned the word trichomes because at the end of the day, what gets us high is not the green, We might call it the sticky green, but it's not the green. It is the trichome heads that are all around that bud. So if you take weed and you squeeze it and you realize that what's left in your hand is a stickiness, that is actually called trichomes. The name of that is trichomes. And within that trichome head, which is a rounded head at the top of a stalk, imagine a pinhead. Imagine a pinhead, so rounded head at the top of the stalk. Within that is the factory of all the THC, the CBD, the CBG, the CBV. Every one of the cannabinoids is actually made in that trichome head because that's a little factory machine. When we are making hash, what we are talking about, hash of any type, is separating that head from the plant. So cannabis as itself in a raw form has a lot of properties that we have yet to delve into, but what we focus on are those trichome heads and separating that to make some sort of concentrate.
That's great.
Was that nerdy enough? Because I could get in further with that, of course.
Yeah. No, I do actually want you to get in further, but just for a clarification point, when you say separate the males, you're saying the female plant bears the flower and the male pollinates. And if you prevent the flower from pollinating, then the seeds aren't produced. And so you have a better quality product to produce extracts. Actually,
that's exactly what I meant to say, that you have said so very well. So the bud actually is an ovary. So if we think about it like that, it is an ovary, and which holds the seed, which will develop the seeds. It has pistils and stamen. Pistils are what you see. They look like very delicate delicate fronds that show up as the plant is growing through the vegetative stage. And if you get bananas, you have boys, because they kind of look like little groups of bananas. And if you have these beautiful white pistils, you have girls. As soon as you see those bananas, you kill those boys. Kill those boys, so that you have these girls who go into their flowering stage, still creating a perfect womb for these seeds, but no seeds are there. And that's what you want. You don't want to smoke weed with seeds. That pops, gives you a headache. So the much better quality is for hash production, and for what you're going to ingest as a smoking product is going to be without seeds.
So then what's the next layer of that nerdiness that you wanted to go into? I mean, I'm particularly interested in more understanding around like these trichomes and sort of, well, you know what, actually, I'm in an unknown place. So I don't even know how to ask the question to go nerdier, because I'm not sure how much nerdier to go.
Okay, the thing is that Cannabis has 23,000 peer-reviewed articles of nerdiness that it could go into. But on not even just the layperson, but the understanding of it is pretty straightforward and basic. Okay, so there are a couple of reasons why the plant has these trichomes. One of them is for protection. The protection from insects that would otherwise bother the creation of these seed pods. You have these sticky trichomes, which really repel insects, which is it's good for us, not so great for insects. So that's one thing. Now, each one of these trichomes, there are 3 types of trichomes, are not as valuable or as useful to us as the best one. The best one is called a capitate stalked trichome. Then you have a sessile trichome, and then you have a bulbous trichome. So you might have cannabis that smells fantastic and does not create good hash. And you say, but it smells great. It has all the terpenes and it looks so frosty. However, it may be a cultivar where the trichomes are very low to the surface of the plant. CBD has a tendency to be like that, very low to the plant. So extraction with certain methods won't work. So I'm a bubble hash maker. Perhaps I can explain this better in terms of techniques. I'm a bubble hash maker. I am looking for particular cultivars where the heads are large and break off the stalk easily. Every bit of cannabis is not the same. Every cultivar of cannabis, how it's grown, where it's grown, all of that will determine how the trichomes will form. And so the hash that I can create and the hash that I can get and the quality that I can get is at first based on the cultivar. BHO, which is butane hash oil, which is another way of making hash, but with solvent, doesn't have the same kind of restrictions because the butane washes over the surface and then literally destroys everything. And then all you have to do is then separate butane, which will off gas, and what you have is a beautiful golden product. I'm not too partial to BHO, but that is an option. CO2 works from a different standpoint with two trichomes. It uses the supercritical temperature to kind of like blast off trichomes, which then will be collected, and then other processes use the rotovate to separate the lipids from pure oil. All of these processes that use the solvent have a lot of, even solventless have a lot of steps, but at the end of the day, the simplicity of it is we are trying to get trichome heads off of cannabis, because all that we need are in those trichome heads. Now, another part to get into this is research is recently coming out within the last 6 months, so not too many people know about it, that shows that the metabolites of terpene production and cannabinoid production are stored in the walls of the trichome heads. That matters because, like I said, BHO prides itself on getting rid of everything and just leaving you the oil in the middle. Rosin, which is another solventless process, will go from bubble hash and then just squeeze and get the oil out of it. But it really just comes down to bubble hash in its entirety, that I feel from experience, and it seems like the science is bearing out, gives you everything that you could possibly need, like the starting off material and the end material. So I will tell you that in the 5 years that I've been writing about hash makers, the most powerful hash effects have always come from full spectrum, or as large spectrum possible, full bubble hash, rather than rosin or BHO or something like that. And so when I say full spectrum, talk to me and then I'll tell you about this full spectrum before there's a misconception of something.
Well, I think for me, I in my mind, I'm seeing bubble hash. I know what that means, right? But then I also don't understand, other than you having described, like, oh, that you're only using this particular part and you're not using a solvent or blah, blah, blah. Like, maybe give us, before you continue on, an understanding of what is bubble hash and what makes bubble hash bubble hash.
Okay. For clarification, what we call bubble hash right now, for the most part, is ice water bubble hash. However, you can have bubble hash as a terminology for hash that bubbles, that was made via dry sift, if you're in some place like Afghanistan or Lebanon or Morocco. So they don't really do the ice water bubble hash making process. However, the top grade hash that bubbles, they call that bubble hash. What I'm saying that I make is an ice water collection process, which is using agitation of water and ice in a washing machine or by hand to physically knock off the heads. Well, using centrifugal force, have the heads break off of the stalk. Then after it has been broken off from the stalk and allowed to collected in water, a series of sieves or bubble bags are used to differentiate the different sizes of heads. When we say heads, we're talking about trichome heads. Mm-hmm. So the bubble bag system goes from 25 up to 220. 220 collects your trash, and everything after that is not necessarily different grades. And that's a misnomer that's said often. It's not necessarily different grades, but rather different sizes. However, your finest grade will often be found in really 3 particular sizes: 73, 90, and 120, or equivalent. Because I say equivalent, some bags are, instead of a 73, it's a 70. It's always a 90, and that 120 might be a 130 or something. But that around that range is where you generally find the sweetest, what they call the sweet spot. That means the terpenes are fully formed, the cannabinoids are fully formed, your flavor, the melt is going to be the nicest, and everything outside of that is a kind of hit or miss of whether it's going to be phenomenal bubble hash. However, like I said, I'm always stressing when people say, oh, this is lower grade because it's 45. No, I've seen 45 being much better than 73. So that's the bubble hash making process. Ice and water, agitating on material, which separates the trichome heads, which drains down into a series of sieves, which then is dried and then consumed. That's the whole process with regard to what bubble hash is there. Coming back to the anatomy, sometimes we have some issues with getting not sometimes, the market right now wants very, very light hash. Because the market wants very light hash, people circumvent that problem by pulling their plants maybe 2 or 3 weeks early.
Light as in like
that's
lightly colored, or light as in
yes,
like,
light color.
okay, yeah.
No, lightly colored, like white, light pale yellow. They want it as light as possible. There's a misconception that that means it's better. The problem with that is that the color of resin is due to a variety of factors. Again, whether it was indoor or outdoor, what the cultivar is, whether it was grown to full term or not, how it was stored, whether it's fresh frozen, and how it was processed. These are a lot of factors that when you're talking to the average person, they're not thinking of all those things. All they know is dark is bad. And dark is bad comes from when BHO was first being done in the early 2000s, when people would blast, that's the terminology for using BHO, blast trim, like old trim, it would, because of BHO's nature of leaching everything, it would bring this really awful brown color with awful flavor of, senesced heads that have died, material that's just bad quality and all of that. So the market says dark is bad. Of course, that makes no sense because people who have been smoking hash in the 60s, 70s, 80s, yes, everyone definitely talks about Lebanese blonde, but there have been a variety of hashes that people have been loving. I mean, Afghani hash that I had last year that was 20 years old was black as tar, and the flavor was ridiculously amazing, and the melt was 100%. So it really is a market issue. Again, so people still, however, you go to the store, you don't know better, want light hash. Growers are unfortunately taking their plants down a little bit early. And the problem with that is that although BHO can make use of that, when you're making stuff like bubble or dry sift, those heads end up being not full of oil. So you might spend all that time collecting, and then when at the end of the day, when it's time to weigh it out, it feels light, and then when it's time to dab it, there's nothing there, or consume it in some other way, there's nothing there. So we have a constant fight with the market, and education is really where we stand with that.
Yeah, it's interesting because in my mind, and I'm really having to expand as I did some research into your work, really expand my understanding of what denotes hash. I like that you clarified like this ice water method, this ice bath, and the like, does it bubble, which is interesting having read some of your articles about it. But for myself, whenever I thought about hash, I always just thought about this beautiful dark brown thing that was pretty much a rock, and I had to use a lighter to soften it up in order for me to break it off into little balls so that I can, spin it up in a spliff and have a good time with it. And then I'm clearly starting to understand that this broad spectrum of possibility that can be used to still produce this product, but have it be in all these different varieties. So unless you want to particularly comment on that, and I welcome you to, I'd be curious to see where you were going earlier with this concept of a fuller spectrum extract.
Okay, so sure. Let me tell you, with regard to hash, it's only in the last, hash as a catch-all. Okay, when I came into making hash in 2014, when people were saying hash, they literally, from what I could see, were still talking about solventless. But hash as a word, again, we as humans like ease. Hash is now all concentrate. So all concentrate, it could even be made with CO2, and people are calling that hash, which seems crazy, but CO2 looks so different than what you described, some caramel, some chocolate, or anything like that. But it's now just become a catch-all phrase for all concentrate. Okay, with that being understood, and it's good that you're opening up your eyes to all the things it can be, whether it's made with solvent, and it goes as far as distillate, which, by the way, distillate has the word distill in there, and just like distilled water has nothing but that H2O in it, distillate has no terpenes, has no other cannabinoids, so it's just THC. And as bubble making pioneer said one time, as much as we love cheese and pizza, if we had a pizza that was all cheese and no crust, it'd be a terrible pizza. Yeah. So that's, we need all the parts in order for it to be pizza, no matter how much we love cheese. So that's where we are going with that. Coming into full spectrum, and again, that has its own two meanings here, and the two meanings in full spectrum. Full spectrum was first being said about hash makers, bubble hash makers who were combining their various microns of heads so that they had a fuller view of what the plant produces. See, the plant doesn't just have like all one size heads. It has some little heads, it has some really, really fat heads. So when you wash the plant, you're getting a variety of flavors because the terpene content you have in something that might be a small 25 micron head is going to be different than the terpene content that you have in a 160 head, right? So there was this differentiation made between people who are willing to capture that full flavor as opposed to people who do single micron. Single micron, it's like, again, you see, I said the 73, the 90, the 120 are thought to be the sweet spot. So what happens is hash makers realize, okay, I have my 90 micron is the prettiest color. The flavor is so phenomenal. So I'm just going to separate out and sell these individually rather than possibly muddying the flavor, even though this whole plant tasted great as a whole smoke. But for the clarification of flavor, a lot of these single micron products have been created. Full spectrum means not doing that and mixing all your microns together. However, in CBD, and that only came in within the last 3 years, full spectrum, it's called whole plant full spectrum, is when you make CBD from all parts of the hemp plant. See, those two things don't even have anything to do with each other. One is about head size, but it's the same terminology, so it's a little bit problematic. What is happening? So with the CBD put to the side, what's happening with these single micron situation? And I believe everyone to each his or her their own, right? I like a broader spectrum because to me, it's like eating the whole apple rather than the clarified Mott's juice or maybe apple cider, but the whole apple. The more microns have, the different flavors I can get into. But again, the market still decides a lot, and the market requires that as good as the hash is, it has to have the highest meltability. And really, those 3 microns is where it really stays between the 73, the 90, and the 120. So to make a compromise, I just combine these 3 and not all the heads, and I call mine broad spectrum. So that's a bigger chunk, a bigger slice, just not the whole apple. Yeah.
So I do want to ask you specifically about what you think makes good hash, and that be a very broad question. But I think I want to get a better understanding first of what you mean by melt point or melt temp. I can't remember exactly.
Oh, melt.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the meltability. Okay, mind you, meltability might not even be a word. I may have made up that word. But with regard to ice water hash makers, we are always concerned about the meltability of a cultivar. No matter how tasty it is, if its meltability is terrible, no one's going to wash it. Right now, you see people taking dabs on dab rigs, right? So you understand a dab rig, it kind of looks like a bong, but smaller. And then it features a titanium, a quartz, or ceramic surface on which to put concentrate. So when people say they're doing dabs, they're putting, generally BHO concentrate on one of these surfaces. The value or the market value of BHO is that once you put it on these surfaces, which by the way, those bangers can go up to $500 to $1,000. That part. Once you put that on the surface and you take a dab, it cleans off perfectly, and then you can take another dab. Okay, so that's clean, no residue. Bad hash, once put on the banger, will ruin your banger. It literally will ruin it. The banger cannot be used anymore, and then it doesn't taste as good. So at the end of the day, solventless makers needed to create a process or a refinement where they could compete with the BHO wax makers. And so what has come from that is everyone wants to make only 6-star hash and or make rosin. Rosin has 100% meltability. So then people cannot say, oh, I'm smoking BHO because of the melt when you have rosin, which is better for your lungs, and it melts perfectly. But the test of a hash maker really at this point with regard to bubble hash comes down to, given a particular material that you know will melt well if washed properly, how much 6-star can you make from that? And that all and 6-star comes from it's a rating system, which is about meltability, which is about look, which is about flavor, about effect, and mouthfeel. That's how you grade hash. Since you were asking, these are all the things that I'm thinking about when I'm judging a competition. I'm going on what it looks like, what it smells like, what it tastes like, what it feels like in my mouth, and what the effect is.
So then for yourself, what do you think makes good hash?
Oh, that's one. Good hash is clean hash. Anything that's clean from the beginning is going to start off well. But what clean means is lacking plant particulate. And so if you're doing a sift process, how well did you sift it such that the plant particulate fell through the holes and you have beautiful resin left? When you're making bubble hash, how well did you wash it so that the heads were cleanly popped off? You didn't have a whole bunch of particulate matter in your bags, so when you're taking a dab, you don't have any char. That's what it comes down to. So hash is good if it's clean. Now, hash is not going to be loved by everybody. I judge competitions, and there are things that I can say. The terps are so loud. The smell is there. The mouthfeel, the effect, but I didn't like the flavor. So to me, that's not hash that I would smoke again, even though I can acknowledge that in terms of its quality, because there's a whole subjective part to it. In terms of its quality, it has fulfilled all what I care about, which is, will it melt amazingly well? And by the way, for your viewers, if you don't know if you have good hash, there is one test that has been done for all time to know if you have good hash. You take a piece of hash, you put it in your palm of your hand. If that hash is hard, if that hash is soft, whatever it is, within 2-3 minutes, it should soften a little. That'll be your first step of knowing, because that 98 degrees of your body heat should be enough to soften it a little. But the end all, be all is the lighter test. Take a piece of hash, put a lighter to it close, and you run it close. What you're looking for is bubbles. If it bubbles, you'll be fine, because and that tells me the plant particulate matter as well, because if you have something that is very oily but it also has a lot of green in it, what will happen is it will bubble, but it will also char. It will bubble but leave blackness all over the place, and that lets you know that's not as good as something that bubbles and then just drips bubbles. That's what you want, just drips, drips.
Great. So then, why? Okay, so this question has two perspectives. The one perspective is very much it's a personal answer, and the other question, obviously, anytime we make an assessment about the world, it's based on a personal assessment, where we're coming from, and so on and so forth. But it's more about a cultural impact, and it has something to do with why hash matters. That's the question, and I'll just put it out there, and it's huge, and I'll let you run with it whatever way you think is appropriate. And the question is, why does hash matter?
Hash, to me, in my opinion, hash matters because as a tool, it's invaluable. We're talking about all of the medicinal effects of cannabis, what it does for a myriad of diseases and problems. Imagine that faster. So at the end of the day, efficacy. So whereas someone is having a massive amount of pain, and maybe they don't do edibles, but by the way, edibles is a phenomenal way to address pain. And they might need to smoke 3 joints, or they can do 2 dabs. They don't have to deal with the consumption of plant matter with that going through their lungs. They can just vaporize a couple of dabs. So at this point, hash is taking off because of its efficacy, its discretion. In many ways, you can take various types of hash things and put them in vape pens, and you can take it on the road. So it's fast, it's easy, and it works. And for the people who are appreciators of cannabis, hash is amazing because it is the most refined way of getting the flavor and effect of that plant. So when we smoke hash, when we smoke flower, we are tasting a little bit of the combustion that is in the flavor. But when you actually smoke hash purely, whether it's dabbing it or using a hash pen or a hash driver or whatever like that, it is pure resin, and resin never lies. The resin on its own, that which gets us, it's a psychoactive effect. It tells the answer of everything: how it was grown, how it was handled, how it was stored, all of that information is in the resin. It's like a magic little tablet. The resin tells me all of that.
Hmm. So, okay, I'm going to diverge from the trajectory of my questions because I have a personal question, and I'm just going to ask you because you are, in my opinion, so far the expert hash person I've ever met in my life, most expert hash person I've ever met in my life, and the question is, I notice that when I smoke flower, I don't like to smoke flower generally, or I won't vaporize it, but I don't really like it. Because I find that there's a consequence to my psychology and my motivation and all like sort of classic pothead.
That's true.
Yeah, but I don't get that when I smoke hashish. When I smoke hashish, I feel like all of a sudden I'm like a philosopher or something. Like, what are your thoughts on this?
Okay, I'm sorry that I didn't understand your question. Okay, definitely. This is how I see it. When I smoke flower, my mind goes like this, it's wide, and there's all these what ifs, but it's like a cloud, right? When I smoke hash, my mind goes like this. I can become really, really focused, and like you say, you feel like $1 million.
Yeah,
you can take on everything. I mean, you're just doing stuff. That is very true. There's something in that part of the combustion of the plant matter that in a way messes it all up. Not messes it all up. That's being too much of a blanket, because there are times when for me I would rather have that airy thought process. But let's say for this, my uh-ohs that I make that are giant weed and they're big joints of weed and hash, they I think give me the best of both worlds. Kind of I can think outside of the box, but also still kind of focus. But I have noticed that smoking flower leads to a spaciness that same cultivar in hash, it's almost as if getting rid of the extraneous and only focus on the resin. And also do know we're missing whatever hash we're smoking, unless you're smoking charas, which is the hand rubbed hash, which is going to be for real full spectrum. We're still only getting a little slice. Where at whatever kind of hash that you're having, you're still only getting a little slice of what the plant has to provide. And maybe for business people and people who are living by the 24-hour day, the smoking of cannabis is not the most ideal for us. For our type A personality, we need the smoking of hashish. But I agree with you. I do agree with you. I definitely still smoke flower, but when I smoke hash, I definitely feel a different trajectory of how my mind works. Rather than exploring all the fractal possibilities of a particular idea, I find that hash takes everything that I've already seen and assimilates it into one thing. So I'm going to agree with you on that one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
we don't know the answer why.
Okay, yeah, that's good to know. Yeah, I have a similar, like I said, it is similar, and it's really interesting to me. It had gotten to the point where I just generally don't feel inclined to smoke flower at any point. I will always move towards an extract of some variety, but in Canada, acquiring extracts is less convenient. You're in California, right? Yeah, extremely less convenient than in California, and because the only way to access it is gray market. I mean, black market, whatever.
Legacy market.
Yeah, but legacy. I like that. Yeah, legacy market. But otherwise, we have these middle grounds, and we got to order it from the government. And the government has not regulated extracts yet, and so they're not legislated. You can't buy them. You can buy them from places that sell them that aren't technically allowed to sell them because only government stores can retail cannabis or cannabis products. But there are still these sort of like above web, common website kind of places that you can order stuff. But other than that, it's kind of hard to get nice hash in my experience.
You don't have hash in Canada for real?
No, of course we have hash, but it's difficult.
Everyone can buy.
Yeah, it's difficult to get nice, like in my experience, it's been difficult to get nice, like bubble hash as you were describing it. But it's quite easy to get all sorts of other types of extracts through the gray market. But so to me, it still feels like such a special thing when I get to smoke, like in my mind, when I see hash, which is like, I put it in my palm and then it just becomes this little goo, and that I can just like break up into little balls and roll into a spliff and just love it. That was maybe an unnecessary little journey into my personal interest in hash. So at the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference, that's where we met. That's where I saw you give a presentation. I might be remembering incorrectly, but I think at some point you sort of confidently said something along the lines of like, yeah, and it gets you high quicker, faster, and that's great. Like that's what we like, right? And I appreciate that sort of unapologetic endorsement of, yeah, of course, it's a good time. Like it doesn't have to, it can help medically and all these other things, but it doesn't have to, and it shouldn't need to for us to have the capacity to bring it into our lives. It's an incredibly low harm substance to consume. And for the vast majority of people who consume it, it's incredibly positive. And so my question here is like, we have medical, we have spiritual, we have recreational, we have chronic use, we have misuse. And I'm curious what your sort of thoughts are on like the modern cannabis culture, and sort of how cannabis consumption is represented in the modern cannabis culture, and where you see that it's maybe moving in a positive direction and maybe where you see it's kind of shooting itself in the foot.
Okay. Well, let's end on a high note. So let's go with the shooting ourselves in the foot. Okay. So at that plant medicine conference, I also revealed that I had gone through a low period in my life when my husband and I had separated. And because I have so much hash in my house, I just literally smoked hash with no intention, completely unconscientiously just smoked hash because I could smoke hash. And it made me feel like not crying my eyes out or crying it out less, And then it had a nice trip. I had a very, very nice soul searching trip, which was actually super painful, but it got my head right back on track.
This is a psychedelic trip, you mean?
Yes. Yeah. I had some shrooms in January of last year. And then interestingly, what I'm having this whole talk at the event about is I think we should smoke more hash. We just smoke it intentionally, but I think as a whole, we should smoke more cannabis. With that being said, we are having some issues with regard to intent. At the end of the day, everything can be abused. That doesn't mean you get addicted to something. You can be psychologically addicted, but not necessarily have the physiological issues. But right now, I have to say, as someone who smokes a lot, I am bothered by this competitive nature of let's take 2 grams of dabs at the same time, which is really very prevalent between the men, generally between 21 and like 29, where in effort to make proof of oneself, they're using concentrates and the ability to consume a lot. And I don't see that as really an issue with concentrates so much as our societal's issue of not having a place for discharging some sort of competitive energies and feeling like there's purpose. So then people just go like water to what's the easiest thing. All right, well, I got this. You don't have that. Let me show you how much better I can be of you than that. So I think that right now, with regard to all drugs that we see, I don't even want to say drugs, with regard to all substances that do some mind altering, that has been my biggest fear with regard to overconsumption. If you look at music videos right now and listen to some of the lyrics, and I don't have any issue against rap, I'm a rapper myself. Some of the lyrics are talking about how much lean can be consumed because lean costs a lot of money right now. See, that's the thing. Lean activist bottles are like $1,200, $1,500. So if you could show off to your friend that you can waste all that money, then you can almost kill yourself. This is problems, and that's not we have an issue with opiates, but that's a societal issue that we are dealing with. So what I am seeing is that there is a move to this idea of, let me show everybody, let me do it for the gram. Let me show everybody how much I can do in an effort to like fill in some level of validation. You understand what I'm saying? Like right now, to me, overconsumption of certain cannabis, and it's not really just flower, it's really concentrates, because you can get a lot at one time and it like blasts your mind. And a lot of people that I deal with on a daily basis, after talking to them, I realize are compensating for something, because I can recognize in them what I was doing. I was like, shoot, I went through 4 grams of hash today because I could. And also my husband left me. It was that was the secondary part that I kept to myself.
Mm-hmm.
And I see that a lot of times people are compensating for stuff. So whereas they're not doing heroin, or maybe they're not oxy, the amount that they're consuming and the effect that they're going for is very much like that. Because when you look at the marketing that is used, it is hearkening to that same kind of mentality. So lack of conscientious use and people just putting any old thing into their bodies, I think that's problematic. On the other side, however, I do feel that with continued education, that you're seeing a lot of people being very intentional about their use, and also knowing that this is something that is going to cause some kind of chemical change in my body, and I should put the right thing in my body. So it's not so much weed is weed, so we're just going to smoke everything. Oh, and it's not even indica and sativa. I'm not quite sure if you're aware that nomenclature has changed quite a bit,
Mm-hmm.
even though it's not in mainstream, but it has changed quite a bit. But really, what is the cocktail of flavonoids and terpenes along with cannabinoids that's going to make my body the best? Like me, I have low blood pressure. I really do not. I used to say I don't want any indicas. I don't want any indicas. However, there are a couple of indicas that make me feel pretty good, though they taste a little bit different than a lot of the indicas on the market. It's really that I didn't like certain terpenes because the flavor themselves and the actioning combined seemed to lower my pressure even more. So then I was near catatonic, and then no fun.
Mm-hmm.
So I do see much more intentional, just people doing their research. We have to give thanks to websites like Leafly and even to some degree Weed Maps and such like that, which have taken the time to break down the cannabis process for the canna curious, so that the average person feels a little bit more armed with information when they go to the dispensary, when they're buying it from the legacy market, or when they're making it for themselves. So I think there's a wide spectrum of that. On one side, we do see some overconsumption that does worry me, because I feel like it's just a shade away from all the other substances that aren't as beneficial to our bodies. And on the other side, I see very conscientious consumption, even down to classes like yoga classes that are built around a particular flower. Like, we're going to do these particular kind of stretches because this particular flower stimulates you in this particular way. I think that's really spot on with regard to getting the best value out of the plant.
So this next question sort of like touches on what you were just saying there, about sort of like moving into hip hop culture and like modern hip hop culture, really sort of not, I mean, there's some pushback. Obviously, it's not just one trend, right? But a common trend is sort of like increase in like how many drugs I can consume and how fucked up I am all the time. And then I feel like having participated, in hip hop as a form of media that I've appreciated over the course of my life, I've definitely noticed sort of a trend. And at some point earlier in that trend, there was the unapologetic embracing of cannabis as sort of like an assertion, sort of like an anti-prohibitionist, anti-racist assertion of like, yeah, we're black, we're making money, and we're smoking this thing that you made illegal to try to criminalize us. Fuck you, smoke weed every day. Which on some level, I see that being an incredibly positive step forward on some level, but then the evolution of that becomes lean and overdosing from Xanax and all the rest. So I had said something about like it got to the point where, blah, 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 now it's lean. So this was going to be my last question, but I'll kind of ask it now because I'm curious where you see the racist origins of cannabis prohibition continuing to influence cannabis culture in Black communities.
Oh, that's a good question right there. Where I see the racist origin of cannabis prohibition continuing to influence. Say the last word?
Continuing to influence cannabis culture in Black communities.
Well, I can talk about that, but that necessarily won't be from a hip hop standpoint, because I can talk about it from a slightly different standpoint. Okay. Yep. So, I touched upon this at SPMC also, which was, 1937, Anslinger, all of that, cannabis, boom, the Negroes, the Mexicans, we're done with that. All right. Fast forward to now. It is constantly asked of me, when I am, again, often one of the few Black people in a cannabis space, whether it's on the super corporate level or in we're at a sesh and we're just chilling kind of level, where are all the Black people? And I thought about it for a while, and I had to draw partially on my experience. My life before being the Dank Duchess included going to people's homes who ended up being Congress people, not just state Congress people, but so that circle of what was called Black upper middle class, I'm used to being in that circle. And I have to tell you, there's a mentality of my son, my cousins, my brother, all these people have been affected by cannabis prohibition in some kind of way. So everyone knows someone that has been to jail for it, whatever. So the idea that right now it is okay really flares up two main feelings, which is, yeah, I don't really know about that. They just accepted us. So I'm not going to stir up the pot with getting involved with this whole with this whole cannabis thing. And the other thing is this mentality, which is justified, which is they criminalized us for this, and now white men want to make money off of it.
Mm-hmm.
The problem, so that's definitely what's happened, which causes, I feel, which causes less people of color to be involved in the cannabis industry that would be if they did not have this past stigma. And that comes in with other groups as well. Asians have their own reasons for not coming in, but it still comes down to respectability politics. In a lot of ways, can we still hold our head up high? And there's not a lot of education, I find, within the Black and brown communities so that people realize that this is a real thing and a real opportunity to get involved in. And above all, for me, is about health, and health will be impacted. So what I find is that by the exclusion and by the stigmatizing cannabis, there has been a reticence to embracing cannabis. And then, however, the young boys and young girls are not having that same kind of feeling, because you know what? Cannabis makes you feel good. And when you're a teenager and you're feeling rebellious and you realize that it makes you feel good and these grown-ups have been lying, this next generation of young people, I'm sure you realize, have a much broader sense of what is acceptable. And that is great and revolutionary. But it often is without context. So problems with that is just like, they can't hold us down, so we're going to do it all. Oh, I mean, I have to tell you that I made a prediction which kind of hurts my heart. But speaking about how you saw people like Snoop and the people in the 90s who like smoke weed every day, West Coast was really, really big on that, like you said, as a bit of like, we're not going to deal with your conformity. We're making money and we're still doing this.
Mm-hmm.
What happened in around the mid 2000s, which was awesome, but at the same time a little bit scary, was that young Black kids decided to follow a rock star lifestyle, which is great. I like that, like busting down the barriers. That is great. However, again, no context. So what I have felt it might happen is that we're seeing a lot of young Black men, I don't know if you've seen recently, dying of overdoses of drugs that white boys been doing for a long time, but they know a little bit more about it. So, and there's more, in a way, not a supportive community, like every white family is like, oh, we're all about the drugs, but there's understanding that there isn't. It's very much, I feel that a lot of young Black boys and girls are coming into this, let's dye our hair, let's live more freely, but newer into the situation. And I don't think the average Black boy knows about Narcan. So you're doing all this lean, but you don't know that, like, if you have dye, there's something that can bring you back. But maybe within other social circles, that's much more available information. So I personally am open to this culture shift, this meld of, this is not what white people do. This is what we all kind of do. But without any educational context, I think there's going to be a problem. And with the whole doing it for the gram idea for the young people, it's going to be exacerbated more so than it would have been 30 years ago, because now we can show off to 1,000 people at one time. And it's like a network of showing off and one-upmanship. The problem is that with weed and mushrooms, well, you're going to fall asleep or going to have some kind of out there trip. With heroin and like a lot of these designer drugs, then you die.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what you're pointing at there is specifically sort of like this intense cultural divide as to like where harm reduction education is being applied in cultural use.
Oh my gosh. Yes, that is exactly what I'm talking about. That is exactly what I'm talking about. The idea that as festivals that like, I mean, you can't say that festivals, the average, festivals have a whole tent where if you're dying, they're not going to give you any shit. They're going to save you because you're dying, this concept. However, the average, Latasha might be like, if my mama finds out, so we're not going to tell anybody, and oh, she's going to die. Oh, sorry. So there's a lack of understanding of what can be done and how best to address these substances. Because at the end of the day, we're not going to make kids not do this. It's not going to happen. So then it comes to a point of like, how do you do this fairly safely?
Mm-hmm. So what do you think? What do you think is the avenue of change there? If I'm understanding this correctly, or understanding your perspective, if it seems like the legacy of racist prohibitionist, like the racist prohibition around cannabis in Black communities has sort of manifested in this way that there's reticence to being like, oh yeah, we'll jump on board with what the white people are doing because now all of a sudden, since they can make money, it's okay. So fuck them. We're just gonna like keep doing our thing. But in doing so, sort of preventing, like kind of like throwing the baby out with the bathwater kind of thing, like preventing all this good stuff from coming in. What do you see? What do you see as like the avenue of positive change there for people who are in Black communities in that cultural context?
I believe that it can be a multi-pronged approach. More than anything, I think it takes courage, and I think it takes people who are willing to stand there and take the brunt of the, how could you do this? And you're just a prominent Black person, but how could you have this mentality? I think what is necessary is a good showing, just like, when we all found out that like, oh, everyone has a gay friend. It was just like, oh, well, the whole coming out of the green closet, I think that would be massive. I think if people realize how much of their friends are doing something in secret and all of that, and we put our minds together, I think that can change things in a relatively short amount of time. But we're all afraid of the reprobation and the ostracizing of oneself out of our communities. And I do believe that level of division is required in order to keep the movement from advancing. So if you keep people feeling like they are not going to have support when they're out there, and then people won't move outwardly of that. When we were at SPMC, we saw Chris talk about when he was talking to the Black ministers. And the truth of the matter is that the Black church is huge within the Black community. Some of us aren't Christians, but within the structure of a lot of the Black community in the United States, the church is like right there in the middle. And until the church endorses it, I'm going to tell you, there's going to be problems because the church family and the church solidarity is so strong that going against that is going against all that's known. And that's not that's not how humans work. However, when people do strike out and do something different and truthfully are successful at it, then there becomes a tolerance toward it. Oh, a maybe. But until that really happens, and it really is going to be treading water or moving backwards, unfortunately, because there's just too much water under this bridge, and there's too many things folded within each other that many people, just the way our minds are set up, the way our society is set up, if it doesn't provide something, an easy answer right now, and you can see how you're cushioned, a lot of people are afraid. And so at the end of the day, it's going to be it's always the young people who have less fear. So I feel like a lot of these activists that are coming up who are pushing things, there's this one guy, Treyas Jarrells, who's big on like football players and CBD. He's been pushing that for 5-6 years. It caused him some problems and everything, and he's pushing it anyway. Guess what? More people are getting on that bandwagon. So it does require that level of courage and willingness to stand up for what's right.
And I definitely see...
Cannabis is right. So
I definitely see how like there's an understandable reservation, Black or not, to open up about substance use, and to do so in a way of being like, yes, And I believe that it's a healthy thing and that it can be healthy because the tendency for humans to be crabs in a bucket, which is, one crab tries to crawl out, the other ones just tear them all down, which a friend of mine a long while back said that he likes that metaphor. If you flip it, he said it becomes, no one's free till we're all free. But the tendency for humans to do that.
Wow.
Yeah, it's cool.
That is a good perspective. Oh God.
So the tendency for humans to do this really causes us to hold each other back. And so kind of like being the outlier is asking a lot of sacrifice in oneself, at least initially, assuming that culture eventually catches up, like this CBD example. I think in fact, this is going to be coming out before the end of February. And on February 20th is the the Thank You Plant Medicine movement. Which might be a great opportunity for, people of, all sort of like gender, racial, demographic to, and class, economic demographic to open up about these things. And I think that would be incredibly positive. You're sort of like the one of many rather than like that one standout. Although there's something to be said, very, very, I think especially in the United States, although I don't live there, and I'm sort of inferring this based on other people's reportings and analysis of the culture out there. It's that me, as a young white man, saying, I take psychedelic drugs or I smoke cannabis and I'm comfortable and confident with that, is probably not going to be much of a problem. But if a young black male does this, the chances of then now being flagged by the police as a potential drug dealer or having, the consequences are greater because the amount of people that get arrested for, it's different now, but like the reports where the amount of people getting arrested for cannabis possession was about equal, I think, I can't remember the details, it was like black to white is about equal, but black people are 2/3 more likely to be to be charged and incarcerated for the same crime. And so I think maybe I'm just wondering too about like what your curiosities, what your thoughts are around how dangerous is that still from a legal institutional standpoint to come out and be confident about substance use as being a healthy thing or being an outlier moving towards greater harm reduction in your communities.
Oh, that is definitely super high of a concern. The actual statistic is that the usage between whites and blacks are about the same, but the incarceration rate is like way higher on blacks. So yeah, that is something to be aware of. That is definitely a concern because I recognize that even though I'm black, I'm a woman, which gives me just a little bit more leeway on the racist trope, of situation. But being a black man saying that like, I support cannabis and I support psychedelics and such like that. Yeah, that definitely puts a much more of a target on his back on what his doings are and such like that. And the narrative that is around what he's doing and what you would be doing would be very, very different because we do within our media and within our society still have very many prejudicial overtones, which makes problems. At the end, it comes down to people's psychology. And when you have these layers that need to be pulled back, no matter what, this guy who's standing up and saying, I am doing this, he's also saying, and in me doing this, I am putting my family, my business, my relationship with my neighborhood, all of that at risk. So it is asking for a lot. And it's still necessary. That's the thing. I don't see how it could really be any different than people en masse. And I think that thank you for reminding me about 220, because I think that will change a lot. If en masse, we all just said, thank you, plant medicine. And it's like, oh, Johnny and Dre. Oh, okay, great. And I think that little bit of encouragement will help. And as the ball rolls, more people will open their mouth. It's right now at the beginning. That's really what it is. It's just at the beginning, but I don't think it's stopping anytime soon. And I realize with life that I'm patient.
So earlier you were talking about, we were talking about that evolution in hip hop from smoking weed, spending money to, wasting money high on lean. Right. And I as that was happening, I was definitely correlating it to the historical movement of in the 20s, cannabis consumption, jazz music, and then eventually cannabis, and people were all smoking grass because it made you, or smoking vipers or whatever, because it made you a better jazz musician, right? And but then that sort of evolved, and eventually it was like heroin, and then people were doing the heroin to be better jazz musicians, and then sort of trying to keep up with like John Coltrane and Miles Davis, Charlie Parker, who, I mean, Coltrane and Davis eventually got off the heroin. Parker, however, it took his life. And then also like Billie Holiday and all the rest. But sort of trying to keep up with that in the form of like being a great jazz musician meant continuing on the cultural trend of what drugs are being used. And that sort of trending in the direction of like opiates and benzos and all the rest. Her face tattoos, unrelated. But
like
I saw this great meme the other day of somebody who had a bunch of face tattoos, and it was like modern rappers look like a graffitied desk from elementary school or something like that. But anyways, another correlation I'm seeing there is that in the 20s, cannabis use and jazz music was an incredibly important place to bridge the racial divide, because that's what caused it was be a problem. We're like, oh shit, my white daughter is going to have sex with a crazy black man because she's high on right? So high on the jazz music and the grass or whatever. But it was also like bridging these racial divides, because it was just like the love of the music and the love of the high. It just brought people together, and the dancing and all the rest. Mm-hmm. Where do you see modern cannabis culture in the current racial climate of United States helping to bridge those divides, if at all?
Oh, I think that's quite interesting, and I think that's another value of having our consumption lounges and our consumption spaces. The person you break bread with, the person you drink with, the person you smoke dabs with, the person who helps you with that, with your chillum, the person who lights, all of that gets set into your mind as a positive experience. And there are a lot of people who are meeting people of other types for the first time in smoking situations, provided that someone's not just like foul and you just don't want to be next to them. There is a lot of opportunity for spiritual growth. There's a lot of opportunity for mending. Without it being like, oh, let's sit down and talk about this, but just by being around other people, our spirits get the opportunity to meld with everybody else. That's crucial. That, I talked about the isolation when I was doing my speech. And because I was a person who grew my own cannabis and made my own hash, I didn't have to interact with people. I could just stay home and just smoke all my own hash and such. But it was me realizing where my happiest times were, which were in Barcelona, where it's all about a communal smoke. Every single club you went to is how we're all sharing together and how we're all putting our spirit to the community as a whole. And cannabis community, I think, is one of the nicest things about cannabis changing, because, I mean, not to speak all on all these musicians doing all different drugs to get to where they need to be, which I happen to feel that was a reaction to the society that they found themselves in, and still trying to get to that place of source where we do all feel good. And at some point, heroin was the kind of energy, that kind of like liquid pulling feeling and still belonging. That was a reaction, I feel, to what was going on at the time. And I think drugs end up being a reaction. And we're still all trying to get to that level of stasis where we, at the end of the day, feel good. People who feel good don't abuse drugs. You understand what I'm saying? If you're feeling good, there's no abuse happening. People who don't feel good hurt themselves. That's something I think that we have to realize on whether we're talking about guns or all the other things that we talk about. Hurt people and hurt societies hurt themselves. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think that's it.
And you see the bridging capacity of communal cannabis smoking as a place where people can get a type of nourishment, like a togetherness that otherwise the lack of is a place of hurting, which then causes abuse and hurting oneself.
I really feel that we don't talk so much about how important it is for us to have these social positive places, just these places of feeling that we can let go of the mask that we had every single day out there in society. And a lot of us have that mask partially because of the pushback that we'll feel about the fact that we smoke cannabis. California is full of a lot of transplants. And a lot of us came from somewhere else because we felt so bad somewhere. Not only did we want to be involved with cannabis, but we wanted to be somewhere where we could just talk about it without feeling terrible. I mean, I lived in Florida for 10 years growing. I was there 13 years, but I was growing for 10 years. And I mean, I can't tell you how many times I talked about tomatoes. There's a lot of conversation about tomatoes. A lot of the conversation does not transport very well when you're like talking about tomatoes, but you need to talk about really, are these pistils long enough? Tomatoes. The first thing that I noticed when I got over here in California is that I can have a conversation about cannabis in the grocery store and not feel like people are looking at me like I am, the Antichrist. That is overlooked so much, that comfort within my gay friends when they talk about the first time they went to the Village and just seeing a lot of other gay people and just feeling like, oh, I can feel comfortable right here. When you have experienced cannabis, you like to experience cannabis, you like to be in that other realm and those broadened perspectives. It doesn't feel good to feel like in a jail of that's wrapped up in shame and isolation. So it's these places of cannabis social consumption that, yes, provide the perfect place for fertile ground. They're fertile ground for new ideas and new systems that will change the world. We had the beatniks at one point. We had the hashish eaters before that. And you will find into a lot of the people who've changed the world, whether it's through music, literature, or any type of the arts, cannabis is right there at the root. You're really into psychedelics. I know you know about psychedelic art. In December of 2013, right before I was coming here to Oakland to go to Amsterdam, I asked Alex Gray and Allison and a couple of other visionary artists who were visiting Miami, like, where does cannabis play in their life, since this was a whole conversation about psychedelics, but where does cannabis fit in? And I was crying when I was making the question. I was crying because it was the first time I mentioned the word cannabis in like where people could hear me and such like that. And I was just so nervous. And Alex looked at me like, he said, it's the beginning of everything. Like, we don't do anything without that like base layer, which allows the opening of the doors. And then we might do more of something else. But at the beginning, it's cannabis. And I have to tell you, that was such an empowering step. And by the next year, I had moved to Oakland to do this cannabis thing, on the legal side. I just feel like providing a supportive environment for people to be their best, you cannot cannot be understated. And after we leave college, we find ourselves as adults very much devoid of places where we have commonalities with people and have reasons to constantly go there. We realize that we really miss out on that structure and that almost forced interaction, which still makes us better people. Now with cannabis consumption lounges, that's someplace you want to go and learn and grow. And like you say, be refreshed, get your cup refilled, and then go about your day.
Yeah, that reminds me. It reminds me of Douglas Tatar, and he's a psychologist that I follow, whose work I really like. He'll be on the podcast eventually again soon. I think you'll appreciate it. But one of the things he talks about is the human process of growing up, and that we don't have to by any means. We can stay locked, but growing up is when we're open and show up to the world, and our beliefs or conceptions or whatever kind of grind up against reality in a way that it's like, oh, this isn't working. And so that grinding sort of forces us to expand the complexity of our understanding about things and about ourselves. And that's the growing up process, because as we grow up, we increase our neurological and cognitive capacity for complexity of understanding and in understanding ourselves and understanding the world. But that if we're locked into a particular way of seeing things, if we're locked into a particular way of being in the world, and we are isolated in that, and we're reinforced in that, there's zero reason for us to mature at all. And so when we're forced to interact with other people who come from different cultural values and differing ideas, and we kind of grind up against each other. I mean, like, I just thought about like 1990s, like in the club, but like when we grind up against each other, there's a forcing, if we're all really in it, to like, oh, what's up? Then we're forced to sort of grow up and consider things differently. But when we isolate, we're not. Like, there's no reason. In fact, it's against our advantage to think about things differently than our group, because then we're less likely to be included by our group. We're less likely to feel comfortable around our group, right? And so in Canada, we have a cultural situation, especially where I live, there are very few venues to go to. There's almost no, like, venues are just dying away, like venues for recreation. And so in the city I'm in, there's very few places where you could just go, where other people are going to be around and you hang out and chat. There's cafes and stuff, but for the most part, those have become mobile offices for millennials on MacBooks, which is fine. I am one of them, right? But it takes away this thing. And the cannabis culture here, there are no smoking lounge spaces. I mean, there are some maybe coming in. There's some in Vancouver, right? But for the most part, it's like you can buy your cannabis, you buy it online. In Ontario, you buy it online, it ships to your house, and you can smoke it in your house and only in your house. You can smoke it in other places, but there's all these different sort of like confines around it. So it's like, it's very much like forcing isolation in consumption in a way that, say, a bar doesn't. Mind you, alcohol is a whole different kind of world that doesn't necessarily produce the positive benefits that you're talking about here. So when I heard your talk at Spirit Plant Medicine Conference, and you talked about how valuable and nourishing it was to like smoke in community, it really showed me how much I don't have that as something that's culturally available to me, and how sad that is. And I thought there was a question coming, but I just had a commentary on what you said. But I think it is really quite important to consider like the cultural context, the communal context in which we consume something like cannabis, because there is, like you said, like there's an extreme value present to being in groups of people who you kind of know, kind of don't know, but you all have this commonality of consuming the cannabis, and then also the psychoactive effects of the cannabis and how it changes your sociability and the way you like make sense of things and stuff, and the opportunity to really to grow up is beautiful, and it's not necessarily available to people even where I live, where it's legal to consume.
I want to just thank you right there, because you just gave me so much to think about. Just this idea of the growing up and the grinding, and it's 100. I mean, my mind is blown, and my mind is blown. I do want to say that I feel that there is a negative impact, especially someone who's been through it, there's a negative impact in requiring people to be by themselves with cannabis, especially with flower as opposed to hash. Because one of the things about flower and just cannabis allows your mind to go places, but without context. There's a reason why they say the idle mind is the devil's playground. Without context, cannabis can allow something to be magnified, and we can get obsessive about that thing and then color the rest of our world while we're in a very impressionable state based on that, and continued cannabis consumption by oneself. I just don't see that. Without it being an intentional, I'm trying to have this cleanse and be by myself, but where you're forced to not interact. So it's almost like we are opening all the floodgates, of receptors, but nothing's coming in and nothing gets to go out. That's terrible. I think I know that exacerbated my depression and my isolation. And the one thing that got me out of it is when I took the mushrooms at that time. That was, I think, 2.83 grams. I took the mushrooms, and I saw from a third person's perspective, oh, wow, you're really isolated and really, really lonely. And it hit me super hard, because at the time I had 20-something thousand followers and whatever, but I'm by myself smoking in my house, and I am super, super lonely. And that's what made me go out and say, I'm going to invite people into my space, and I'm going to even better just go into their space, be willing to be uncomfortable. I think cannabis does a very good job of putting the lube in the uncomfortable part to then like, look, it's not so bad. Oh, look, it's not so bad. Look, I did open and expand my box, and I can handle more. And I think that idea of not having to grind up against reality is, I think that's super telling. I think that is super telling. And I'm sorry about your situation that you have in Canada, especially how big Canada is. I can only just imagine just all these souls just separated at their house, and you don't even interact with the bud tender or have that moment of, oh, we really like this flower and talking about it. There's something so very personal about it being online, And by the way, I hope mushrooms never get to that or any other kind of psychedelics. I feel that would be truly heartbreaking. But I know that's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah, there is it's a different situation, I think, with psychedelics because it's a lot less easy to consume alone and it be mostly fine most of the time with psychedelics because it opens up a different part of the mind that isn't necessarily so peaceful and dissociative. Like cannabis really can be a great way to completely check out, like check out to the point where it's like, yeah, you didn't feel isolated because you were high, but then the mushrooms were like, hey, PS, you're isolated and you're lonely and you're using cannabis to hide from that, and it's like
100%. Yeah. That's exactly what happened. It was like, oh, I'm so lonely. Oh gosh. But it changed my life. So I'm very thankful for it. And it hurt so bad, but it changed my life.
That's what it is, like back into the Tataran stuff. It's like, yeah, well, if we don't feel those feelings, they're never going to finish.
That's true.
Yeah. I mean, that's my conception of his work. But anyways, let's draw to a close here.
Okay.
Let's draw to a close. And I don't know what the legalities are on interstate or
you
distribution.
Probably should erase this part though.
What's that?
Probably erase this part.
Okay. Well, okay.
Well, I know. Probably erase this part.
So okay. How can people who are in the United States legally acquire the hash that you make? Because you do produce it. Do you produce it for legal stores? Oh, okay. You stopped producing. Okay.
I stopped producing. So I was on the medical side, all the way till the medical process, for the most part, ended because everything got grandfathered into recreational. So what I do now is consult. So I basically go to people's farms and teach them how to make hash or hold classes. I've been doing this whole international classes thing. And I'm having my first class in Oakland in 1 week. So that's what I basically do, teach other people to make hash because I feel badly about people not being able to have agency over their own wellness and their own happiness. So if you have a couple of grams, I'll show you how you can make that hash and you don't have to buy it from anybody.
Okay, that's great. So then my misunderstanding, how do people who are listening now get involved with taking one of your classes, hiring you for consulting, or just generally following your work more fully online?
Oh, sure. I can be found on my website, thedankduchess.com, TheDankDuchess, and social media, it's all The Dank Duchess, everywhere along the way. With regard to my class, the link is in my social media and on my website, so they are more than welcome to click that.
Great. Well, Duchess, thank you so much for being on the show. I had a great conversation and looking forward to meeting you again in person one day. Maybe next time we'll smoke some hash together.
Oh, I didn't know you wanted hash, darling. I will definitely smoke you all the way out.
Great. We'll see what we can do. And
all right.
Thank you very much for tuning into this episode. Definitely check out the Dank Duchess on social media, as well as one of her educational experiences if you happen to be in a city where she is. Thank you for sharing this podcast with a friend and checking out the ATTMind Clips channel, where smaller sections of this episode will be available. It's a YouTube channel, and there's not many subscribers yet, so become a subscriber. That'd be great. And supporting the show is also great. Patreon is the best way to support. For as little as a cup of coffee a month, you could know that you're helping make this podcast continuously available for everyone who enjoys it. Other support options are at jameswjesso.com/support. And that's it for me because my throat is very sore, obviously. And I hope this doesn't sound too terrible to you. Again, thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you in 2 more weeks for the next episode of Adventures Through the Mind. By that point, I will hopefully be sounding a little bit more jovial.